So Darren, thank you very much for joining us. We're very grateful for your time. So obviously,
Thank you for having me.
you had your victory of the Electoral Commission. You must be delighted.
I am. I'm absolutely thrilled because, and I tell you why. I think this isn't just about me. I actually think, and this might sound a bit grand and a bit verbose maybe, but I think it was actually a victory for the 17.4 million as well, because there has been such a massive smear campaign against that vote for Brexit. There have been attempts by now discredited whistleblower reports to smear that vote, and there have been attempts to say that it was all a Russian conspiracy, and all of these things are starting to be dismissed. We're starting to see a pushback within cabinet. We've actually got to leave cabinet now. So I think that, that what started on that Friday as my victory in court, the 17.4 million have actually had a pretty good week over the past however many days it's been.
So you're saying you think the action against you is part of a kind of wider campaign to delegitimise the Leave vote?
Definitely, I do. And if you'll allow me to explain,
Oh, please.
There were 3 investigations by the Electoral Commission into the same issue, my referendum, my conduct during the referendum. And I don't understand how. So they cleared the first investigation. They said everything's hunky-dory. This is a storm in a teacup. Absolutely fine. Then they opened a second investigation a few months later, and that was cleared. Everything's fine. And then wealthy Remain activists decided to, through a judicial review in courts, apply pressure in the courts and against the Electoral Commission. And they decided then to open a third investigation. So our so-called independent guardians of our democracy caved to pressure from wealthy Remain activists.
Yeah.
And that to me suggests that there's something wrong with those who are supposed to be at the forefront of ensuring that our, the ballot box is protected, and they are there to ensure fair and independent, umpire. When clearly they're not. Clearly they are kowtowing to wealthy Remain vested interests. And that's what that was. So they opened their third investigation into me after pressure from these wealthy Remain activists. And I think that goes to the very heart of this entire thing. They have been completely unable to accept the outcome of the referendum, and are so desperate to do whatever they can to stop it, even if that means ruining my early 20s. They're more than willing to do it. And I don't just mean the Electoral Commission, I mean those that were applying pressure to the Electoral Commission. But my problem with the Electoral Commission is that they allowed themselves to become the vehicle for these people to do these sorts of things, when of course they should be the independent guardian of our democracy. And I just really do not believe they are. I think they've been totally compromised.
I mean, do you think Brexiteers can have any confidence at all in the independence of the Electoral Commission?
No, I don't actually. I think if you looked at the fantastic stuff that the Sunday Telegraph was doing, their investigation found that I think a majority of and they reported this, I think a majority of the Electoral Commission have put out anti-Brexit statements or said that they regret the outcome of the referendum. And I don't understand how those at the the upper echelons of the Electoral Commission can claim to be independent when they're out there making these statements and grand speeches about how awful it is that the stupid people at the bottom have done this.
I mean, you hinted at this earlier. I mean, obviously, you're a young guy in your 20s. I mean, to be dragged through court must have been, a horrible experience. I mean, how worried were you about what was going on?
I mean, so so for 2 years, after 2 investigations, I thought, right, this is over. It's done. Relax. Because my poor mother, I was brought up by my mother on her own. She's 300 odd miles away. And it actually got to the point where I just wasn't calling my mother, because I would tell her things and I'd say about the court case or whatever. But earlier than that, about the investigations. and she would just panic, you know, she would just, and that's natural, isn't it? You would,
Yeah.
of course, you would be worried about your child going through something like this. So it actually distanced my relationship with my family because they were just so concerned. And during that, so actually when I called her and told her I'd won, I realised I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. When I called that, you must hear this. When I called her and told her I'd won, she was in the queue at Asda, and she started to cry, and the person serving her must have thought that she was completely mad, because she just started screaming, he's won, and the person serving her was like, what are you talking about, you crazy woman? But yeah, it was nice. But 3 years of absolute misery. So my mother actually seriously offered to sell the council house that she bought under right to buy to pay for my legal fees.
Blimey.
And that just goes to the heart of, and I'm sure you can imagine when you've got your mother telling you that the proudest moment of her life was when she bought a council house.
Yeah.
Proposing to actually sell that asset that's given us security, an asset that's something she can pass on to, I've got other siblings, pass on to my family. And that was the first time during the 3-year period where I just broke down in tears. I thought that was absolutely awful. And actually, I did cry in the courtroom after I found out I'd won, but I think that was just a complete sigh of relief. But yeah, it's not been nice at all. It's been truly awful, and that's why I think you've got to start having a serious conversation about whether this so-called guardian of our democracy is actually fit for purpose. And I would argue it's not. We've made this Quango judge, jury, and executioner. It has vast powers that it can use against people, and I think if it's going unchecked and it's investigated the same issue 3 times, and then on a 3rd attempt found that I'd ticked the wrong box in order to get some wealthy Remain judicial activists off of their back, you've got to start, I think, arguing that it's really not fit for purpose. And I don't think anyone who's not highly partisan either way, for the Remain side, isn't going to argue that it is fit for purpose. Because I think there are so many people actually who've said, even there was one tweet from a Labour Lord who said, I don't think that Darren winning his case has got enough coverage. Because it actually is an injustice. And I thought, wow, this is clearly having cut through, that the Electoral Commission hasn't acted even-handedly or followed due process. And that's happening in Britain in 2019. That's pretty damning, I think.
They gave you, it was a £20,000 fine, wasn't it?
Yes.
I assume that would have been just devastating for someone of your age.
Yeah, well, and someone of my very limited financial means as well. I was brought up in a council house in the northeast of England in a single parent household. I didn't have that to fall back on. Fortunately, and it was one of the first things I said in my statement outside of court, actually, is that I'll be eternally grateful to the around 3,000 people that gave an average donation of £30 to my crowd justice campaign, which allowed me to actually see off these vexatious accusations against a biased regulator. Well, supposedly a regulator. I'm not sure what it's regulating. But yeah, of course it was concerning. It used to make me feel sick to the pit of my stomach. And if I'm honest, there was part of me that just thought, well, I wonder if I can raise the money and just pay the fine. But I thank God and the support network that I've got around me that I didn't do that. Because can you imagine if I'd accepted the offences that a judge has, and don't forget that the judge wasn't the judge saying that the fine was too high. This wasn't the judge saying it was unreasonable. This wasn't the judge saying that they'd erred a little bit in fact and law. This was the judge completely quashing their entire notice against me. It was comprehensive. It was 2.5 hours of argument in which the judge completely annihilated all of their arguments. And you've got to start thinking, what's going on here? You've got to start thinking, if a judge sits for 2.5 hours and goes through in with a fine-tooth comb, arguing that everything the commission's put forward is wrong in fact and law. These people are supposed to be guarding our democracy. I mean, what the bloody hell is going on here? It's just completely mental. And the reason I probably sound a bit strong on this, but
No, I understandably.
3 years of my life completely ruined. But I don't want to see this happen to someone else, because it's in the Electoral Commission's statutory requirements, really, to boost youth participation in our democracy. Who in their right mind in their early 20s would want to be the responsible person for a campaign if there's a, God forbid, if there's a future referendum or a general election, to put themselves forward? I think actually people would be put off after hearing, reading about and seeing what's happened to me. Because if you get on the wrong side, if you're on the wrong side of the argument and the wealthy Remain activists or whatever apply pressure to the commission, they will cave and they will go after you 3 times. What does that say about the state of our democracy because of these unaccountable and remote commissions who are, I mean, they're barely accountable to Parliament. It's just, I think it's just gone too far. We need to have a serious conversation about the entire, I think, the powers that these regulatory quangos have. I think it's gone far too far. It ruins lives. I mean, it could have completely ruined my life. It almost did. I accepted that I would go bankrupt, but I also accepted that I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't fight this. And thank God that I had the balls and the courage to actually see it through. I don't know where I got them, where I found them, but I managed to get through it, and thank God I did.
I mean, were you kind of blown away or impressed by the amount of support you had from the wider Brexit movement? So in terms of crowdfunding or legal fees, that kind of thing?
I was surprised, but I think I don't think actually for the most part it was about me. I think it was about the wider movement. I think it was about we've been told, if you look back to 2016, we were told time and time again that this is your decision. The government will implement what you decide.
Yeah.
But there was a caveat applied to that, and there was a caveat that we weren't all made aware of. The government will implement what you decide as long as you don't vote to leave the European Union. And it's just been a constant attrition of our morale. And I think they thought for the last 3 years that Leave campaigners, the 17.4 million, would just forget about this. They'd just accept it. They'd roll over. They'd say, okay, well, I'm bored of this now. I'm getting pretty tired of this. I can't be bothered with Brexit anymore. But they haven't. They've kept that up. And I think through my campaign, they've made that absolutely clear. 3,000 small donations. That's massive.
Yeah.
It certainly was massive for me. And as I say, I really will be eternally grateful to everyone who donated to it. But yeah, I think it was about the wider movement, and that's why I was so happy that eventually we've started to fight back, and we've got a Leave cabinet now, and everything's hunky dory. So yeah, I think it was about more than me. I really do, and I know that might sound a bit grandiose.
No, it makes sense. I mean, one thing I noticed, so this is just something I picked up on social media, is that you were getting a hell of a lot of what I describe as trolling or very nasty comments from certain Remain activists. I mean, including some quite prominent ones.
Yeah.
I mean, especially before the conviction was quashed. I mean, were you surprised by just how vicious the response to your actions was?
Yes, in a nutshell. My mother actually used to read some of these tweets, and she'd call me and she'd be quite distressed, or she'd send a text message saying, I'm really upset by some of the things I've read, because it would be things like, I can't wait for you to go to prison, you're going to be raped in prison, you're going to love being raped. I mean, actually they're borderline homophobic as well, from the so-called liberal metropolitans, the pro-EU enlightened liberals, engaging in dabbling in homophobic slurs. I mean, so she'd have to read all of this. But in the end, James, I ended up directing her to my crowd justice campaign, because obviously there were about 3,000 comments that would be updated every few days. And people would just leave comments saying, thank you so much for everything that you're doing, for fighting this. You are so brave. Your mother must be so proud. And she would get to read all this instead. And that was a great source of encouragement, not just for me, but for my wider family as well. But yes, I was surprised by the venom and vitriol directed my way, because it was just, I can't understand. So I personally would never, ever wish something like rape on someone.
Yeah.
And if this was happening to someone who was on the Remain side of the argument, if rape, I wouldn't even call them rape jokes. I'm not, they're not jokes. That's not funny. Rape, I don't know what you would call them, but if that was happening to a Lib Dem activist or a Labour activist or a Labour MP, the media would be in uproar at what's happening. But because it was me, it was just accepted. But I think you're absolutely right that I had a message from a friend actually, and he said, you know, Darren, I would often read your tweets and look at the replies underneath. And he said over the past couple of weeks, not even that, I've noticed a massive change. There's been a complete, they've stopped doing that. And what it's taken is me to be cleared in the courts. And for me, I was completely exonerated in court. But I still can't understand what would possess someone to send such vile comments to someone just because they're their political opponent. And I wouldn't even describe it as being a political opponent. My mind doesn't work like that. I don't think of people like that. You're a human being that expresses different views and opinions to my own. You weren't brought up with small c conservative values in the same way that I was, and that's fine. You know, that's absolutely fine. I can sit around a table and have a chat with these people, but they can't do that with me to the extent where they would actually feel the need to send me rape jokes. I mean, this is just
Horrible.
It is horrible, but it also says something about the decline in political discourse. But interesting, I think it's often argued that this is coming from the Leave side of the argument. These aren't Leave campaigners sending me these things. These are the so-called enlightened, liberal Remain campaigners that are sending me jokes around rape. And they were doing it day in, day out. If you search Darren Grimes rape, it will come up with you will have reams of material. So yeah, it did take me by surprise, which was a very long-winded response. But I think you can tell by my response that it really did knock me for six, actually.
Yeah. I mean, say some of the people. This is just from what I noticed myself, but some of the people making those comments seem to be quite high-profile individuals. So kind of like within universities or within civil society. Have you had many people apologising to you since you were exonerated?
Yeah, so I've had a few broadcasters actually delete, would you call them broadcasters? Radio presenters. You can think of a very prominent Remain.
I think I know who you mean.
Yeah. I'm not going to name his name because unlike him, I'm not wishing to smear someone's reputation, damage. But to their credit, they deleted a tweet that was calling me a criminal and saying I deserve everything I get, blah, blah, blah. And they deleted this tweet and actually apologized. Now, I've seen others do that as well, but people like Owen Jones have left up their tweets accusing me of being a criminal. And again, I just think if the shoe was on the other foot, there would be more, if I was a Remain activist, there would be more of a media. The BBC, for example, James, didn't actually, on the Today programme, didn't report the fact I'd won my case. But and that's actually, I think, the BBC running it from noon till dinner time, reported it non-stop. Darren Grimes reported to the police. Darren Grimes fined £20,000. He must have done something bad. You know, he must be a terrible person. Go my pretties, accuse him of criminality and wish him ill and all the rest of it. But when I won, on that Saturday morning, I expected them to read out my statement. Not a thing. And that's how I found out, actually. I found out I'd been reported to the police and fined £20,000 through the Today programme. And I thought that they would have at least given me my statement and read that out. And they didn't. And it's just, I think you have to seriously ask, why is that? And is it because it doesn't suit their Metropolitan Remain narrative? And at one point, if you told me this if I heard someone argue this a few years ago, I would have said that that was completely mad conspiracy theory, tin hat nonsense. But I don't think that anymore, because I think I'm actually living proof that there is this bias in the media, that there is this bias in our Remain commentators, which make up the most part of our commentators, right?
Yeah.
But they've had to roll back on these things. And I must admit that, victory tastes very nice. It's very sweet, but also I feel really, I don't look back on it with anger. I actually look back on it with sorrow, because I think it just says something about the state of our politics and the state of, I guess, the bias that's rife within our mainstream media. It's quite sad, really, and it's quite sad that someone in their early 20s who had their life turned upside down by a quango that was kowtowing to pressure from Remain campaigners and making charges against me that have been completely quashed in a court of law. They're not willing to give me a fair hearing and put that, make clear that I've been exonerated of these charges. But they were very happy to say, when I had been fined that initial notice and referred to the police, that to me says something about our politics.
I mean, turning to more recent events, so obviously we now have a new Prime Minister, which I'm sure you're very pleased about. We got Dominic Cummings in number 10, who's very much a critic of what I think he calls the kind of quangorocracy. I mean, do you have some faith that some action will now be taken around issues like the Electoral Commission and other quangos, or do you think they're so entrenched it's going to be really difficult to do anything?
Well, I mean, if you mentioned Dominic Cummings, the education lobby would have said that the bubble, as they called them, back before Dominic Cummings went in with a sledgehammer and started forcing through free schools and things like that. People said it can't be done. It can't be done. The education groupthink is far too entrenched, and he did it. So I'm more optimistic that things will be looked into. I don't think that the Electoral Commission will be a priority for this administration. Let's be honest, they've got, how many days? Is it 92 days now until October 31st? They've got a lot on their plate, and they need to get on. They need to get on with delivering that vote over 3 years ago, biggest democratic mandate we've ever given MPs. For them to turn around now and say there's no mandate for leaving, that's not the government, but that's some MPs are starting to say that, we need to refresh the mandate. That's what all of this has been about. They've thought, let's drag it out for as long as possible and people will just forget about it. But they haven't. I think the Leave movement is very much still there. And actually people are more enthused and I guess more livid with the fact that this is happening to begin with, that they're not going away. And I don't think it'll be a priority, but I think it certainly should be something that's looked into. I noticed that Bernard Jenkins select committee, I forget what you call that. It's the Constitution. Is it the Constitution? I forget what it is, but anyway, you can find that out with a quick Google search.
Sure.
I think they're actually holding or gathering evidence for a report into what is the Electoral Commission for.
Okay.
And my response to that would be, well, it's not to ruin the early 20s of those who they happen to disagree with, or who wealthy Remain activists happen to disagree with. So hopefully that could lead to some serious reform.
Now, obviously, I mean, Boris has promised to get us out on October the 31st as planned. There may be a majority in Parliament that doesn't want that to happen. I mean, how confident are you that Boris will actually manage to see it through? Or do you think there's going to be, we're staring down the barrel at a general election?
I think people are understanding now that it's pretty serious.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to get that. That every sound that's come out of Number 10 and every statement on how we're hiring 500 new border force employees, the Chancellor's ramping up no deal spending, we're actually starting to do these things that should have been done a long time ago. I think it was entirely reckless of the government not to make serious preparations for no deal, because don't forget, that's the default. You know, you invoke Article 50, and if you don't vote for a withdrawal agreement, then the default is to leave without a deal. That has always been the case. So for people to turn around now and say, where has no deal come from? No, you voted for it. You voted to invoke Article 50, voted to start the process of leaving without a withdrawal agreement if you don't vote for one. Now, Parliament's rejected that, I think probably quite rightly in the end, because of concessions not being made around the backstop. And actually, I think another reason why I'm more optimistic about no deal is that Boris has just refused point blank to speak to anyone in Brussels until they say they're willing to talk about the backstop. Exactly. So that to me suggests that they are serious about it in a way in which the Prime Minister Theresa May never was. It was pretty damning, I thought, when Michel Barnier came forward and he said, Theresa May always made clear to me that she was never willing to let the UK leave without a deal. And so Brussels had us over a barrel from the start. And I think this government's making all the right noises to suggest and make absolutely clear that we're not going to be pushed around, that we are the world's fifth largest economy, that we can, make the most of the fruits of independence. I read this really farcical tweet that said, it could be, under a no deal scenario, it could be a few years before we sign a treaty with the EU. We could have a few years of no deal. I thought, what are you talking about, a few years of no deal? Do you mean a few years of independence, a few years of leaving the European Union, a few years of what we voted for 3 years ago, the biggest democratic mandate in British electoral history? People just seem to have completely, they just still don't get it, and I'm not sure they ever will, really. It goes back to what I said earlier about this sort of media groupthink. But in a nutshell, yes, I am optimistic. This is that we finally have a Leave cabinet.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that the failure to prepare for no deal under May and Hammond, do you think that was a kind of deliberate ploy to take it off the table, essentially, to mean that either would leave with a kind of moderate, or what some would say is a Brexit in name only, or we wouldn't leave at all? Or do you think it was just cock-up incompetence?
I think it was a mix of both. I think it was definitely to make no deal seem unpalatable, because we haven't prepared for it. But secondly, I think it was because they never had any intention to ever leave without a withdrawal agreement. And therefore, why Philip Hammond basically did say, why spend money on something we're never going to do?
Yeah.
So it was just never the intention. They never wanted to give the UK the clout that it needs in these negotiations.
Yeah. And just one final question. If we don't leave on October 31st as planned, what do you think will happen, and what do you think that'll do to faith in politics?
I think there'll be a complete collapse in trust in politics. And I think that we in the United Kingdom have been quite fortunate that we've escaped extreme politics on either side, whether that be the extreme politics of the hard left or whether that be the extreme politics of the right. You've seen neo-Nazi parties elected to the European Parliament over recent years. You've seen communists elected to the European Parliament, and even in some parliamentary chambers in nation states. The UK has avoided that. But I think if you turn around to 17.4 million people, the biggest democratic mandate for anyone or anything in British history, and you tell them that the ballot box is broken, that we have a political class in this country that has not and will not listen to them, people become desperate. And millions of people voted for the very first time because they actually thought that this was their one opportunity to bring about genuine change in this country and get us out of the EU. Millions of people just wouldn't vote again, or would turn to the political fringes. And I think that would be really bad for our democracy. And, you know, that might be welcomed. They might think, well, that's millions of people like you, Darren, that won't vote again. But isn't that a sad state of affairs, that we're actually welcoming the apathy, widespread voter apathy, instead of actually cherishing the democracy that we have fought for time and time again, whether that be through democratic processes, whether that be through wars. You know, this is a country of John Locke. This is a country of parliamentary democracy, and I think we should cherish that, respect that. You know, my grandfather, for example, he died last year, but he was my personal and political hero, and he fought for the British values of freedom and democracy in Korea against a tyrant. And look at South Korea now. Look at how they prosper. Look at how their democracy prospers. And you know, that's a real proud achievement. Britain did that. You know, Britain helped bring that about. For us now to turn around after championing democracy around the world, for us to turn around and be like, actually, we only like democracy when it's done on our terms. What does that say to Hong Kong? What does that say to Russia? You know, those democracy movements there. I just think it would be so dangerous. But I'm optimistic that it won't happen. You know, we've got the right
Sure.
people in power, and I really am more optimistic and more enthused in politics than I have been since June 24th, 2016. So let's suck it to him, I say.
Well, Darren, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.